We are entering a room with all the early family furniture going back to the 1890s. On the door, we have a certificate from great aunt Alice Steves, who got a certificate for 4 years of reading of a group called Chautauqua that taught reading and religion. And above it is a painting by George Lamb of a house we have not been able to identify. So come on in and see the rest of the family stuff. On the back of the door, we've got a typical type of wall hanging that they put stuff in. Antique socks and slippers in it. And hand warmer. A collection of baskets. Some are very old and some are not so old, but none of them are recent. Most of them are probably 100 years old. This is a pitcher and bowl and commode that belonged to my third cousin, Leila Ireland. Her mother was Maggie Westcott, who was Bessie Steves' sister. And this was a pitcher and bowl set that they got when they were married on their wedding. The backdrop and the drawers was a special dresser that everybody had in their bedroom to put their pitcher and bowl on. And this set belonged to Bessie Steves. And it's full of sewing and various cloth materials of different things that were stored away in the cupboard and in the drawers. Next, we have a mannequin, and on it is a coat of mine that I bought in the 60s when we first started. Well, I was farming at the time and thought I'd have a ranch jacket, and so I bought that for myself. The hat we found in the rafters of a house on Chatham Street, and we've identified it through the pictures. It was in the Trite's house, and that was Maggie Trite's hat from the 1890s. On the wall above is a painting of the Steveston waterfront and the fishing boats that I bought way back in the 60s. And then the design in the big gold frame belonged to my Aunt Abby Westcott. She and her husband Wes belonged to the Knights of the Pythias, and that was I guess their slogan of their credentials. The next picture is interesting. It's actually painted on the glass, and it's also one that I bought in the 60s. Down here we have a set of commodes. This is a chair and a bowl, and that was in the attic of this house, and it probably was used maybe in the house before this house was built. Instead of going out to the outhouse, you had your own chamber pot. Quite often they kept the chamber pot under the bed, or they had a special chair. And when I was little, this was my chair and my chamber pot. So even little kids had a chamber pot. Yeah, it's got a little picture in the back of it. I don't know the history behind this one. This may be one we acquired at some time. The rocking chair is one we acquired in the 60s to match the rest of our rocking chair set. This is one of the old gramophones I purchased. It's not a family thing. It's just in this room. This is just a few of the hats from the 1920s that belonged to my mother. We've got boxfuls of them up in the cupboard. That's what they wore in the Roaring 20s. Yeah, those would have been bought new in the 20s. Yeah, they're not secondhand. These are all my mother's hats. Although I think this brown one was my grandmother's, but I'm not sure. Yeah, these go back to before I was born. I was born in 1937, so these are the hats she would have worn at that time, or in the 20s before she was even married. Because these are typical 1920s hats for a young woman. The watches, believe it or not, are all family. Nobody ever threw anything away, and I got those all out and laid them out, and couldn't believe how many we had of watches. That most of them don't work. Some actually do work, and some were very old. This one is a wind-up watch with a key, and my dad said that belonged to his grandfather, but I don't know whether it belonged to Manoah or whether it belonged to Alonzo McElhenney. But one or the other, it belonged to them. And this one belonged to, on my mother's side of the family, it belonged to Granddad Dan McLaren. And it's got a knife on it with his initials on it. This one was mine, and it's all held together with Scotch tape. And the watch fob is a coin that Manoah Steves used for his watches. He just punched a hole in the coin and used those for the watch fob. There's some interesting ones here. I think this was my dad's. I don't. This one was another one that belonged to me. Watches like that when I was a kid, you could buy for $1. Yeah, this is one of my dad's watches. It's a different shape. These watches, a lot were my mother's watches. This one and a few others are my watches. The two clocks, I don't know who they belong to. They're ones we found in different family collections, Aunt Ida's and Aunt Alice and Leonard and a lot of people. And some of the watches came from some of those places as well. Oh, and the radio belonged to Granddad Dan McLaren. That's why it's up here. And those things are from Africa when my mother Maud Steves, my dad Harold Steves Sr. went on a trip to Africa. The picture belonged to Bessie Steves. We don't have the bowl and we don't have the commode, so all we have is a pitcher. I'm assuming somebody else on the family got the rest, and the reason they didn't take this, it was badly cracked, but we actually glued it together. Yeah, and I was in the Boy Scouts, and this was my scout hat. Okay, this dresser belonged to Martha Steves and would have been in the original house that was built in 1877, and it was painted over top of the varnish. We stripped the varnish off and found a burn mark down on the drawers. You can see it way down here. This drawer is burned. They'd obviously dropped a kerosene lamp and set it on fire. So we decided we wouldn't repaint it or wouldn't revarnish it. We'd just leave it the way it was so that people could see what it was like when you were living in the housing in the 1800s with no electricity. All of the stuff that's on top of the table is family stuff. This whole box is full of jewelry that belonged to my mother. These are various things. I think this belonged to Aunt Abby. This is her powder. The hat we found in the attic of the Quinn house. The Quinn house is the little 4-room house we have in the backyard. And when we broke through the ceiling, we found that hat and Maggie Quinn's report card from 1894 were up in the eaves. So I guess that probably belonged to her father. So that's a 1890s hat. And there's some of my mother's jewelry. The knuck is a brush, and that's very early plastic. That belonged to Uncle Earl McElhenney. The dolls were pin cushions. There's 3 of them there. Those belong to my mother, I guess from the 1920s and 30s. A couple of corn cob pipes, I don't know where they came from. And back here, that was my blackboard. And it folds down as a table, blackboard, and you could scroll through it and get pictures to come up. And this was my little table and chair. And this was our very first gramophone. This one's the only family gramophone that we had before I started buying gramophones. This one belonged to my mother from the 1920s. Just a very small, simple gramophone. The mannequin has another one of my mother's hats and an umbrella that we assume belonged to Bessie Steves. This one was in the attic. We found a couple of them. The pictures on the wall, the one on the corner belonged to my mother. The one next to it was a picture that we bought in the 1960s. This belonged to my father, Harold Sr. In the early days, your collar wasn't attached to your shirt. You had to button it on somehow. And so you put your collar in here. And so this was for putting collars in. And if you look in the drawer here, we've got a collection of collars. And these are the stiff ones. Imagine wearing something that stiff around your neck. And why you needed so many collars, I don't know. I guess you just put a clean one on every time you went out. And the other drawers are full of more clothing and cloth goods. Okay, this is another gramophone that isn't family, but we've left the gramophones in there. We needed counters to display the stuff on. This pitcher and bowl belonged to Bessie Steves' sister, Maggie, or Aunt Maggie as everybody called her, and she was married to Gus Westcott. So this belonged to Maggie Westcott. And Leila Ireland, who owned the other pitcher and bowl set, was her daughter. This is another old umbrella found in the attic. And on the window ledge, I've got a collection of old knives. Some were mine, some belonged to various other relatives. Yeah, this one was mine when I was a kid. That would have been a new knife when I got it. And I had my own axe. And it was designed to fit on your belt, but oh, the belt goes through there. You put your belt through it. It was part of Boy Scouts, but everybody took a knife. I remember we used to go to school barefoot, and I remember we used to have draw a circle in the dirt and put lines across it. It was a game called pie, and then you'd throw your knife at it and cut the pie up. And I don't remember exactly how it was played, but I do remember very well one time that the knife hit the stump of a tree and came down between my toes. So I don't know if it was that knife or not, but sometimes just knives like this that we use for playing pie. But it came right between my toes. Some of them have initials on them. You can probably tell whose they are. The old wedding dress is one we purchased. We were traveling on Vancouver Island around in the early 1970s, I guess. There was a museum called Whippletree Junction, and they went out of business. And they auctioned off their stuff. And so I bought the old wedding dress. This dresser belonged to Bessie Steves, and it was a dresser in this house. And this was Bessie Steves's clock. This red container with the mirror and stuff in it, that belonged to my mother. And most of the other things up on top of the shelves were family stuff. The gown on the mannequin, that was mine when I was little. And the rubber boots he's wearing, and the shoes that are worn out, those are mine. I think we may have put a hole in the shoes to put the post through it. The chamber pot, that one's for when you're sick and lying in bed. Aunt Winnie, as I said before, was a nurse, and she had all that equipment should soldiers become ill or hurt during the war. And her mother, Bessie Steves, was an invalid for the last few years before she died. So we don't know whether Winnie had it for World War II or whether she had it for her own mother. Another one of my mother's 1920s hats. And then we have the bed. The bed with the iron bedstead, that was my father's bed. The orange and red cushion cover, that was knitted by my mother. And the cushions beside it was an old-fashioned way of taking a cloth rather than throwing it away and sewing it up in designs to make cushion covers, and that was done by Aunt Ida. This is an electric heater for warming your bed. And the bedspread was my mother's. I suspect it was one from when she was first married. And then we have a whole pile of bedspreads that were made by various family members. Everybody made their own quilts. And we've got 4 quilts here, and we have many more quilts in storage as well. Before they had electric heaters to warm your bed, you filled this full of hot water and put that in to warm your feet on a cold night. Because the houses in those days weren't well insulated, when you heated your house with a fire on, the fire would go out at night. So you wanted to warm your bed up, and you'd use a heater like that. When they got electricity, then you used an electric heater. The carpet we're on belonged to Grandmother McLaren. That was one of her living room and dining room carpets. Now, this cupboard here, I have no idea what's in it. It's all books from Aunt Ida Steves. There's Chautauqua magazines and books and diaries and everything dealing with the church and the things that they were doing in the early 1900s. But we just never ever had the time to go through it and see what's in it. So someday somebody in the family will have a year's work going through that cabinet. All this stuff is probably around 1900. Okay, this is a whole collection of different types of bags they had. All family stuff just found in different houses, Aunt Ida's and Grandma McLaren's. And we have belts, suspenders. And when we open the drawer up, we have a closet full of clothes. The white coat is my lab coat when I went to UBC. Actually, one of them is. There's a couple. One of the others belonged to my dad. He wore a white lab coat when he inspected beef in the 1950s. A lot of the clothing belonged to my Aunt Abby, but there's clothing that belonged to my mother and various other members of the family as well. Up there is a diploma of some sort. I'm not sure who that was for, and a couple of watercolor paintings that I bought in the 1960s. That pretty well covers the early artifacts of our family, and thanks for watching.